One thing I've learned doing this series is that sometimes you can get a feel for if a game has something deeper lurking inside after the first few minutes. Even if it has a rough exterior, there might be an inkling of originality or a good gameplay system that just takes time to get going. Turok isn't one of those games. You get exactly what's on the box. The game starts off with one of the most shameless ripoffs of Aliens I've ever seen, a strong statement if ever one there was for video games. As these things go, you're jettisoned right into a gameplay tutorial where my NPC partner spent several minutes resolving some goofy pathfinding issues, and then in Aliens fashion, the mission goes awry and you have to fight your way to survival with a ragtag group of badass leathernecks, only instead of xenomorphs you're fighting space dinosaurs. You may notice the game is named Turok, which is also a series of games featuring first-person shooting and dinosaurs, though this has next to no relation to the time-traveling Native American adventures of the N64 classic trilogy. Honestly, you can change the main character's name and it's easy to convince someone this was Capcom's attempt at Dino Crisis 4, a reboot in the vein of Grin's gritty Bionic Commando reboot around the same time. At least that would make sense as a series progression because Dino Crisis 3 was already in space. That being said, the story, while cliched and incredibly predictable, isn't a bad time. Taken on its own cheesy action movie merits, it's well shot, features some impressive facial animation, and surprisingly well acted, even featuring a slightly disinterested Ron Perlman in a co-starring role for much of the game. The entire game is incredibly bare bones, with a plethora of multiplayer-focused achievements versus the few single-player ones, making the whole thing seem like an obligatory shell for a multiplayer suite. There's no collectibles or branching paths, there's not even an option for subtitles in cutscenes or dialogue. The game also has a very odd flow between third-person gameplay, first-person gameplay, and cutscenes. The cutscenes will sweep in and out of Joseph's head, an obvious callback to the N64 games that actually works pretty well. But navigating the environment pops you into third-person for climbing objects, interacting with quick-time events and ephemera like stealth kills, and sometimes this works for transitioning from third-person to cutscene, but the constant cutting in and out never stops, and makes it harder to get immersed overall. It's a bummer because the cutscene direction and flow between gameplay is actually pretty smooth. I just think the constant third-person navigation and quick-time events is a step too far. This was the golden era of brutal quick-time event stealth kills, and Turok has them by the boatload, so at least they're fun to watch, I guess. The downside is that the stealth mechanics accompanying those kills aren't very good. Enemies are easily alerted to your position and swarm you, so you might as well go in guns blazing at all times. This unfortunately means the bow weapon is essentially useless. While it is pretty high damage, it also takes longer to aim, shoot, and reload than just gunning enemies down with the ever-present submachine gun. Speaking of weapons, to call Turok's weapon selection pedestrian is an understatement. You'll use the same basic submachine gun throughout, but even the few standouts, like a sticky grenade launcher that explodes upon a second trigger pull, are missing the panache and style that made the original game stand out. You'll find no creative weapons like the cerebral bore here, just the lamely named sticky gun. There is a solid shotgun with a nice spread that shoots as fast as you can pull the trigger, and you can wield about every weapon in the game, which does count for something, I suppose. Ironically, the knife is one of the most effective weapons. If you close the distance between yourself and most enemies, you can put them down in one fell swoop. Like the other camera transitions, the animations that play out feel remarkably smooth and satisfying, even after seeing the same few over and over. It's one of the best ways the game actually makes you feel like a muscle-bound badass, even if it is downright comical how Turok will just slice through entire herds of dinos with just a knife like a sushi chef on amphetamines. The gunplay itself is a bizarrely mixed bag, mostly due to the decision to lack any kind of aim-down sight mechanic. Instead, pressing the left trigger during gameplay simply zooms the view in like Turok is squinting to make something out into distance. It's another element that feels undercooked, and it's a shame because the shooting is otherwise really solid. The weapon feedback and sounds feel appropriately chunky, hit effects are full of sparks, smoke, and blood, and the vibration and recoil help to feel like you're handling some piece of dangerous machinery. The enemies accompanying the gunplay are unfortunately pretty boring. As you make your way through the campaign, you mow down scores of faceless gray stormtrooper-like goons that could honestly be plucked into any number of other sci-fi gray-brown shooters from the era. The aforementioned hook of the game, dinosaurs, make up the other half of the enemy roster, and while they are vastly more interesting to engage with, they bring their own suite of problems to the gameplay experience. First, I want to commend the design team on trying to create the illusion of a living dinosaur ecosystem throughout a linear game. Herbivores will graze and flee, different species will move in squadron-like formations, and there are plenty of wide-eyed moments as larger dinos hunt and track smaller creatures like an Unreal Engine 3-powered nature documentary. Little touches throughout the otherwise sparse environments, like nests of eggs, piles of bone, and other little details, really give the player a feeling of trespassing. on territory they shouldn't be on. It's a shame that the AI isn't quite up to the task, and the dinosaurs' large, goofy bodies often get caught in between their navigation and the level geometry, but otherwise they are consistently cool to look at and be around. That is until you notice you're being followed by a compy and it activates your Jurassic Park: The Lost World PTSD. The enemy dinosaurs come in a few varieties, including velociraptors, who are the most common in the game. They're a legitimate threat, swarming you in large open areas and quickly overwhelming unprepared players. The downside here is that they knock you down a lot, leaving you open to other attacks while you're getting back up, unable to defend yourself. This means getting knocked down will often result in you taking 2 to 3 more hits than originally intended, and also gives the dinos time to get behind you for more damage, and getting knocked down when you get back up. I personally split on how these combat encounters play out. On one hand, the bigger dinosaur moments can be frustrating, aimless, and confusing as you're attacked from every direction and the screen turns red, further obfuscating your ability to retaliate. On the other hand, it does offer a really nice change of pace from the brain-dead shooting gallery of the other enemies, and it feels legitimately threatening. I guess it comes down to how much you're willing to put up with frustrating combat encounters for a pitiful amount of gamer score and doing wrestling moves on space dinosaurs. The game does diversify its exotic enemy roster later in the campaign, but it's a shame that so much of the gameplay is taken up with alternating fights between space marines and standard dinosaurs. When the creativity picks up and you're fighting giant spider aliens and mechs, the game does hit a more fun stride. Unfortunately, that's hardly where the frustration ends. The game also has abysmal checkpointing, intensified by often putting checkpoints just before cutscenes and long sections of blasting through enemies. It's not a game that's legitimately challenging so much as every death is an eye-roll-inducing trip backwards through 10 minutes of gameplay. Then there's the environments, which are, as might be expected so far, a mixed bag. You've got a standard array of grey military bases and large caves and forests. The environments are actually legitimately large and impressive at times, and feature plenty of lush scenery and lighting effects. I will give props to the environmental design. Where I was prepared for a by-the-numbers hallway simulator, some of the larger areas were a pleasant surprise, with multiple winding paths and supply caches tucked away for attentive players. The larger areas also let the more impressive encounters with enemies like T-Rexes breathe nicely. The art department tries to vary the color palette a bit with sundowns and other times of day, but despite that and some nice atmosphere, it's not enough to make any of the environments stand out from a dozen other games, at least visually. Which is a good way to sum up Turok overall. It's fine. It's actually pretty fun once you get into the swing of things, though the whole experience is dragged down by a slow opening and spotty checkpointing. Unfortunately, for all the good parts, it's also a lot like a lot of other games. You've shot these space marines, you've seen these caves and military installations before. There are some good times to be had stabbing dinosaurs and fiddling around with the game's arsenal, but it's hard not to see this game as a failed reboot that doesn't come close to capturing the variety and creativity of the 90s original series. A strange relic from a bygone era, I was afraid of revisiting Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon at first. I was afraid what I remembered as a satisfying, goofy spin-off title would be little more than a tired retread, especially after I've spent the last decade playing Far Cry sequels and other similar open-world games made in the Ubisoft mold. I was pleasantly surprised to find the exact opposite. Blood Dragon might be one of the best, if not the best, Far Cry game, and its high-speed progression and solid gunplay hold up remarkably well almost a decade after its initial release. Blood Dragon is an exceedingly, gleefully, simply minded game. A pastiche of 80s-era VHS sci-fi tropes ripped from Terminator, Rambo, Aliens, Predator, and more. It's silly in the same way a lot of other 80s parody media can be, but I give Blood Dragon extra points because it was doing it before it was overdone. It wears its influences on its sleeve. Your starting pistol is basically the gun from RoboCop. You wield a similar shotgun to Arnold in Terminator 2. The opening level plays the same music as the helicopter ride in Predator, and so on and so forth. The main character is even gruffly voiced by Michael Biehn, who is famous for his roles as Kyle Reese and Hicks in Terminator and Aliens, respectively. Despite the game's age and how overplayed 80s parody is at this point, Blood Dragon still manages to elicit some laughs with its ridiculously cheesy dialogue, one-liners, preposterous story, and over-the-top characters. You play as Rex Power Colt, a cyber commando going up against his old commanding officer Sloan, who is threatening to kickstart the next world war. Racing against the clock and Sloan's personal army of cyborg super soldiers, you need to shoot your way to victory and save the Earth. Oh, and there are laser-shooting dinosaurs, the titular Blood Dragons. The story is mostly told through static NES-style cutscenes. While this method is somewhat charming at first, slickly emulating the style of classic games like Ninja Gaiden and remaining true to the 80s exploitation feel, it comes across more like a budget constraint, but I'll talk about more of that in a bit. I will say it probably features the funniest sex scene in a game, an admittedly low bar, but one I was pleased to see Blood Dragon uphold. The gameplay is unsurprisingly similar to Far Cry 3, with the weapons, vehicles, and enemies all being reskinned and slightly altered versions of the ones players are already familiar with. The biggest asset of Blood Dragon, however, is that it isn't just a reskin of Far Cry 3, but that it takes every aspect of Far Cry 3's gameplay and progression and supercharges it. Where Far Cry 3 is a sprawling open-world epic with each upgrade being hard-fought, drip-fed to the player, Blood Dragon simply doesn't give a fuck. It's constantly overwhelming, constantly making you feel more powerful, and for that reason, it's an absolute breath of fresh air. Take the guns, for example. You have your standard variety of shotguns, sniper rifles, pistols, and more, all kitted out to look like cheesy vaporwave artillery. However, you can quickly upgrade each of these weapons by tackling small missions at each outpost, and not just in small ways, but in leaps and bounds that drastically change how they're used. For example, a high-powered sniper rifle can shoot explosive rounds that will destroy vehicles in one hit. A shotgun can be upgraded to have 4 barrels, and so on and so forth. The weapon selection is so overpowered that it's hard to choose favorites, honestly. You have a laser-spewing minigun, a flamethrower, a submachine gun that can be upgraded to shoot head-busting lasers, and all these you can only carry 4 at a time. I know, game balance, but I feel this game could have benefited from letting the player just Duke Nukem it and carry all the weapons on their back. Oh, and speaking of head-busting laser, the Cyborg Cyber Commando headshot animation remains one of the most satisfying in a game. It's on par with many of the satisfying headshots in a game like Destiny. Not actually gory, but the little pop and ensuing mess of goo and smoke make it more valuable purely due to how visceral it is. It's like a little hit of dopamine each time you get one. Anyway, Blood Dragon's adrenaline rush style of progression makes it worth revisiting. It manages to fit the 30-hour-plus journey of a standard Far Cry game into a sub-10-hour orgy of guns-blazing action and explosions with laser dinosaurs. There's little care for balance and longevity because the game is so occupied with making sure you have something to blow up and have fun in the moment. The game's visuals also hold up gracefully. The island is drenched in dark purple and red hues, accentuated by various neon lighting and copious amounts of lens flare. While it sounds obnoxious, it actually works well in conjunction with the VHS-era premise, and the darker palette covers a lot of the visual flaws that Far Cry 3's sun-drenched paradise has a harder time covering after all these years. As an aside, it's well known that the turret sequence is one of the best staples of the genre during this console era, and I think Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon might have one of the, if not the best one of the bunch. I don't want to spoil it, but it's a good time and a fun treat to close out a ridiculous campaign. The biggest problem with Blood Dragon is the game's obvious budget limitations. The reused assets from Far Cry 3, including simply retexturing animals in a chrome texture and calling them cyber animals, is goofy though forgivable. But the real bummers are the bigger moments that felt planned and cut, relegated to the Ninja Gaiden-esque NES cutscenes. These moments include a showdown with a shark octopus monster and even the final boss. The confrontation with the main baddie is entirely in this static cutscene style, which is just a bummer. I wonder what Blood Dragon might have been given a proper full production budget, but given how good everything else is, I think these concessions are perfectly acceptable overall. Blood Dragon isn't a deep game by any stretch, the story is thin, the gameplay is recycled, the enemies are all fairly similar, and you can finish every aspect of the game in about 10 hours. But it's fun. The gameplay is satisfying, the open world is crazy, and I can't help but recommend it on the concept and how well it executes that alone. Sometimes all you need is just to turn your brain off, laugh, and shoot some cyber commandos in the head. And Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon has that in spades. Like Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon, Shadows of the Damned is a shooter from another era. The Attitude era of action games in the mid-360 years, where crass sexual innuendo was the currency of the realm and style and gore was all you needed to have a good time. And Shadows of the Damned has all of these. Developed by Suda51 with gameplay designed by Shinji Mikami and music by Silent Hill's Akira Yamaoka, Shadows of the Damned, at least on paper, is a horror shooter wet dream. Silent Hill was still in the gaming zeitgeist, Shinji Mikami was hot off Resident Evil 4, and Suda51 was making waves with the help of Gonzo Grasshopper manufactured creations like No More Heroes. The result is an over-the-top stylish adventure featuring macho demon hunter Garcia Hotspur facing down the legions of the underworld to save his love Paula, who's been captured by the demon lord Fleming. It's an overly simple premise that makes for an engaging grindhouse gameplay experience. Unfortunately, the game's development was fraught with delays and creative interference from EA, who funded the game. The result is a far cry from the intended vision, though still miraculously an artistic triumph in its own right. True to Shinji Mikami's style at the time, the game is a third-person shooter immediately recognizable as the same ilk as Resident Evil 4, with a similar camera, quick turn, and laser sight reticle for targeting enemies. The gameplay is much faster though, including a quick dodge roll and faster enemies that make the game feel more like a Devil May Cry style turbo mod for Resident Evil 4 at first. Other Resident Evil 4 staples make an appearance, like vaulting and interacting with doors and legends with no jump or mantling buttons, and stunning enemies for quick melee takedowns, including a variety of wrestling moves. Never changed, Shinji. And Suda, honestly it's a toss-up whose idea the wrestling moves were. The main gimmick mechanic of Shadows of the Damned is darkness, though it's really hard to call it a gimmick because, unlike most games from the era, it's a selling point that sets it apart from other shooters that's actually woven into almost every aspect of gameplay. The main thrust is this: the underworld is full of darkness, stand in it too long and you take damage. This leads to all kind of navigational puzzles where you need to light, relight, and position points of light to illuminate areas. This could have been a boring, tepid way to create gameplay variety, but Shadows of the Damned also uses the darkness mechanics in combination with enemy encounters to make some really nice tension during gameplay, in turn mixing up enemy waves and types to constantly keep the game fresh and interesting, even if it's just the same few gameplay tricks dressed up in different ways for 6 hours. In true Suda51 fashion, the game does mix up the gameplay itself, occasionally dipping into genres like side-scrolling shoot-'em-ups. While this section was a brief fun diversion at first, poor checkpoints, high damage, and loose controls quickly turned it into the worst and most frustrating experience of the game. It's like the game is intentionally trying to fuck you over at every turn, and I don't like it. Also, if you get frustrated in this section, don't make the mistake of thinking the checkpoints will put you back if you want to come back after quitting later. You have to play the entire excruciating section again. I made this mistake years ago when I played the game for the first time, and as I loaded my game and found myself at the beginning of the level I was almost finished with, I remembered my mistake, but it was already too late. Don't make my mistakes. When the gameplay doesn't engage in half-baked mandatory minigames, it's a slick, satisfying shooter, though one with some caveats. The gunplay and targeting works well, and players familiar with RE4 and RE5 style controls with quick turning and quick time events during gameplay will be able to pick up the gameplay immediately. The biggest problem with the gunplay is the variety. Garcia Hotspur's talking demon friend Johnson transforms into 3 forms which basically relate to pistol, shotgun, and assault rifle, with each playing to different self-explanatory strengths and weaknesses such as range, power, etc. But you quickly unlock all of the weapons, and any additional unlocks through the game are just alternate forms of these weapons. This aspect, combined with the crowded boss fights and an overall short runtime, just feel like disparate aspects of the game that weren't fleshed out as intended and needed to be shoved into the game to make a ship date. Speaking of bosses, Shadows of the Damned has them. It's a rarity in this era of shooters for sure, but thankfully they're all better than most other third-person shooters, where a boss would commonly just be a regular enemy or permutation thereof with a shitload of body armor. The bosses run the gamut from towering monstrosities to lithe, invisible assassins, and each encounter smartly utilizes gameplay mechanics the player has been learning through the boss's respective chapter to triumph. But like the guns, there's an aspect here that feels rushed, with some boss styles such as the Grim Reaper sisters being reused multiple times, and some gems that are usually awarded for beating bosses just falling into your lap after a cutscene, sans boss fight. The bosses and their designs, however, are wonderful. In fact, nearly every artistic aspect of Shadows of the Damned is. Despite being a clearly Unreal Engine 3 game with the famous texture pop-in and bloom fully present, the game plays to the engine's strengths, relying on obtuse lighting and saturation to create a unique, gritty visual style. The overall style works really well with the dingy textures, creative monster designs, and excessive blood and gore to form a truly moody, atmospheric experience. Of course, the expertise of Silent Hill's Akira Yamaoka on music does plenty to aid that as well. Most shooters from this console generation were known for having a boring, grayish color palette, but Shadows of the Damned is a bold exception. Even linear pathways and brief sections of gameplay made me stop and gawk because every aspect is so artistically well constructed. It remains a beautiful game despite its issues with pop-in and occasional frame rate drops, and it's a shame it's been removed for some reason from the Xbox backwards compatibility so more people can't play it. Not just because of the phenomenal art, but because more people should get to experience this bizarre experiment of a game. While it doesn't have the same proud beating heart of some of Suda's other work and feels trimmed around the edges by EA's corporate interference, it's a worthwhile relic from a bygone era, one that manages to be a memorable, unique spin on its creator's previous work. It's ridiculous, gory, oversexed, and absolutely beautiful, and they truly don't make them like this anymore.